Good.
Welcome back to Wenn Schon Denn Schon, my YouTube channel. And today, my guest is none other than Brett Dean, I'm going to say this in the right order. I'm going to say composer, violist, and conductor. How does that sound for an order of proceedings?
I reckon that's pretty accurate. Yeah. Thank you, Jeff.
And it's such a great pleasure for me to welcome you. Brett and I, we've met at a few different junctures throughout the years. But Brett, I'm actually going to fire at you my standard first question, and I think it's going to be tricky for you. In your career, if you had to name just a few memorable performances, and because you're a composer and a player, you can choose where you want to take them from, but performances that you've been involved with and why they're memorable to you.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I could start with something quite out there, and whilst I've sort of had all these memorable experiences with people like von Karajan and so on. One of the first things that put on the spot like that I always remember was when I was still in Australia playing in a string quartet. And we were taking it really seriously, even though ultimately we went our separate ways. But we had this quartet called the Ambrosian Quartet. Wonderful, wonderful time, very formative time. And we did this concert in Nimbin. Okay, so dope city, really, the sort of the place where the Aussteiger of Australia all go, the sort of the ultimate sort of retreat for the alternative community near Lismore on the northern New South Wales coast.
I've been there.
Yeah, it's a beautiful spot near Mount Warning, and we did a residency that was actually organised by Richard Mills, worked with some young composers there, and did a recital in a sort of a community hall that was beautiful, kind of actually quite like a Queenslander. It was like a wooden shed with a corrugated iron roof. We did this very bizarre program. We started with a Haydn quartet, which is kind of fairly standard fare for a quartet recital, and then went via Britten 3, Benjamin Britten's final quartet, which was written only months before he died, and then finished with Shostakovich 8, which is a kind of, very heavy statement about the horrors of war and the idiocy of mankind and so on. And we were kind of thinking, oh my God, this is a very heavy program to play for a, regional audience. But it was one of those, why it sticks in my mind is that it sort of just goes to show you can never predict and should never underestimate an audience and where they're prepared to go with you if the circumstances are right. And so, we were a pretty good band, and we'd played a lot by then, and we'd played those pieces quite a lot. And also then this atmosphere, there were families there with young kids, dogs, came in and wandered through. And whilst we got to the second half and were playing this devastating Shostakovich quartet, this gentle rain started to fall, and you could hear it on the corrugated iron roof, and this very somber atmosphere was just being lapped up by this audience. And perhaps, because they're a kind of an alternative lifestyle community, there were quite a few sort of, intellectuals and poets and writers and, arty types there. And it was just astonishing. We were just blown away by how much this music in that moment meant to these people, and the power of communicating music, even in circumstances that you don't expect. So that was a really memorable early experience. Then I'd have to say from the time that I was in Berlin, which we might come to, some of the formative performances I remember from that time were often opera, and the standout from that time with Claudio Abbado conducting was doing Strauss's Elektra on various occasions, but particularly the last time we did it. So we did concert performances in Berlin, then did a season of it in Salzburg, staged. And then we took it to the Maggio Musicale Festival in Florence. And of course, Abbado being in Italy, he was, at home and he was adored. And it was one of those moments where what was not always an easy relationship between Abbado and the orchestra, particularly in that still relatively early time, post-Carry-On time. Carry-On was this, colossus, this extraordinary ship that left an enormous path in his wake, and very, very difficult shoes to fill for anyone. And Abbado was, perhaps the most ideal musician to fill that position at that time. But even for him, it was not an easy time. And that was one of those experiences where you felt that it really gelled, that he was then bringing his personality to bear on this orchestra that was still kind of basically still in the Carry-On years, and remembering that extraordinary relationship. And also just to get to know that music. Strauss, Elektra, it remains for me one of the great and most potent operatic experiences imaginable. Playing in a string section that was just hot. This was one of those pieces where just everybody really, gave it their all. And it was a fascinating lesson for me as by that stage, quite, ambitious, but still very early days composer myself. It filled me with ambition to write opera myself, but it also taught me, quite fascinating and interesting and vital lessons in orchestration, in scope and emotional power, in architecture of large forms, and also specifically in terms of how you pitch technical difficulty in an orchestral score. Because the thing that truly fascinated me about playing Elektra at that time was that the parts themselves, the viola part, for example, was really difficult. But if you gave it enough time, it was actually all playable. And there's a very interesting point there where if it's too difficult, that even with putting in quite a few hours at home, it's still just kind of, that some bits you're just going to end up faking. And they say, even though I've never played the Ring Cycle of Wagner, but they say that, some of the passage work in the strings in Wagner operas, I've played Tristan and Parsifal. So I know a little bit of what that feels like. Some of the passage work is just so difficult that you kind of gloss over some of it. Whereas there was something extraordinarily soloistic, even about the viola part in Elektra, that you somehow then tap into a level of energy writing for orchestra that, that really taught me something about how to pitch particularly sort of ambitious, technically demanding material for an orchestra to play. So that sort of sticks in the memory for all sorts of reasons. And I mean, personally then as a composer myself, I'd have to say one of the most satisfying early and formative experiences was, well, the premiere of my very first orchestral piece, which was in Brisbane in 1995. It was with the QSO, my hometown orchestra. It was written for my brother Paul, a soloist, a clarinet concerto. And it was also the first appearance in Australia ever of the German conductor Markus Stenz, who became then a very dear friend through that experience and experiences after that time. And also an incredibly astute musical mind that he was, particularly with preparing and presenting a brand new piece. And the sorts of things he drew my attention to were incredibly formative. And just, it gave me this shot in the arm that I thought, wow, I was completely bitten by the composing bug by that stage. And the next day there was this barbecue lunch with Richard Mills, who had actually commissioned the piece. So I'm mentioning Richard now for the second time, and it's fascinating how people that you can meet very early on in one's sort of career. And I mean, I go back with Richard even further because he was the very first conductor I ever played under as a young violinist, still at school and playing in the Queensland Youth Orchestra's third orchestra. The very first concert that they ever gave was under the house, the big sprawling Queenslander that belonged to Diana Doherty's family. Her parents had this big place, and the orchestra played in this sort of garage area under this big sprawling Queenslander. And anyway, at this barbecue the next day after this work, Ariel's music, was premiered, Richard came up to me and he said, you know, you're a composer now, you've got to take this seriously. And it was the sort of wake up call or word of wisdom that I needed to sort of clarify it for myself. I think that, I really did want to pursue composing. I'd always had this feeling of, well, I've never actually studied composing, so it's all a bit of a hobby. But he was the one person that made it very clear to me at that pivotal early point that I should really, take it seriously and run with it, which I duly did.
Wow, Brett, I'm going to first of all just comment that I've asked this question now of about 15 or 20 people. I've been doing these interviews, and your answer, I think it's going to be a while before I get as an articulate and I don't want to say all-encompassing, but I feel like in those three memories that you've shared, it is a bit of a microcosm of your life and your work. So did you plan that? Did you already plan those three answers?
No. The funny thing is I did have a Zoom session with an Australian violist who's doing a postgrad thesis in Holland at the moment. And this was just a couple of days ago. And then in the course of that, some of these things came back to the front of my mind. I have actually seen a couple of your interviews, but had forgotten actually that you start out with this. So then I thought, oh Lordy, yes, there's that. But so these things, but I mean, at the same time, they are. I hadn't really thought about the concert in Nimbin for many, many years. But put on the spot, I'd have to say, you go then to those things that help you make the decision of wanting to be a musician in the first place, and that was certainly one of them. I mean, I could also include any number of
course,
early experiences with the Queensland Youth Orchestra too, and led and formed by my dear friend John Currow, who passed away a couple of years ago, and who was a hugely pivotal person in my life. Those early experiences of playing in the QIO were also part of what helped me decide that, oh, this is a very particular buzz. I'd like to do this. So I mean, anyway, so there are things that are there in one's, sort of memory bank, in one's memory palace.
What's interesting to me, apart from there are many, well, I could now easily talk for 20 minutes about your ads and all the things I found fascinating and interesting. I just want to comment on a couple of them. First of all, I don't know the Britten third string quartet, and I will duly listen to it. The Shostakovich eighth string quartet, as a Shostakovich fan of now 30 or 40 years, the eighth string quartet, because it covers so many of his pieces, it's an amazing work. And I can imagine a little bit why that was so successful, perhaps unexpectedly, but still it's such a powerful work.
Yeah.
What I did want to comment on, and it's interesting because when I was talking to Håkan about your trumpet concerto, which he very directly and without any prompting, he really classes it as one of the major concertos that he's been part of. He put it in the same kind of categories, the Henze and the Gruber and Maxwell Davies that he's performed. So really one of the big works that's been created and conceived for trumpet and orchestra. And when we were talking about that, it reminded me of when I'd heard your piece Beggars and Angels with the MSO, which was kind of touching for me because of the tuba solo in memory of our dear friend Frank. But I commented to Håkan that I feel like you're a musician's composer because you write so idiomatically for the instruments. And so when you were reflecting on Elektra, how the idea of making it difficult but playable, it made me think, well, of course, after, an intelligent thinking musician playing for 15 years in the Berlin Philharmonic, playing a lot of great music and absorbing it all. But I do want to actually now dig into a little bit. We'll come back to Berlin in a minute, but I'd like to dig into a bit when you compose, how did you learn how to write for all the instruments?
Well, I mean, you touch on working with Håkan, and that's a very one of the best cases for me as a composer was writing a trumpet concerto. By that time, I'd written quite a lot for trumpet in an orchestral context, but the sessions that we had, one in particular, a long session that we had when I was guesting with the Swedish Chamber Orchestra in Örebro, which is a couple of hours out of Stockholm, and also a couple of hours from Håkan in Malmö, and we met there and put aside a whole afternoon to go through a set of sketches that I'd managed by that stage, and just to sort of get his take on what I'd come up with thus far, and just opening up the world of extended techniques, of material, of mutes, of muting, and what that all meant. And he brought a whole array of possibilities with him, and just tapping into his life's experience. That's sort of how that was a very intense long session along the lines of what I'd been sort of doing while I was still in the orchestra in Berlin. So I then quite early on was consciously pursuing possibilities to learn by as the Germans would say, learning by doing, the delightful way in which they adopt all these gorgeous sayings in English that you don't really normally say in English, but still.
So true, so true.
Like my speaking on the handy. Anyway, what I did, I got into more by chance than design, but I had these various opportunities in Berlin to write for groups that were all made up of one instrument, most famously, of course, the 12 cellos. So I wrote a fairly large scale work for the 12 cellos. It's called 12 Angry Men. When I gave them the score, they thought I was having a bit of a go at them. And they were all men at that stage. There are at least a couple of women in the cello section now, but it's still quite conservative bastion there in Tiergarten in Berlin. But anyway, what I found, and then that was followed by a piece for 4 trombones, a piece for the 8 horns. What I found in those compositional challenges was that when you have just the one instrumental type, you really have to dig deep so that it doesn't become this bland brown color. Particularly in all 3 cases, they're kind of low to middle tessitura instruments, and they can very easily get very muddy. The cello, of course, has this extraordinary range, because it can sound like and almost embrace the full tessitura of a chamber orchestra, all within 12 cellos, and which is why the 12 cello group of the Philharmonic is such a famous, band in its own right. But you really do have to examine coloristic possibilities, and as a favorite saying from a friend in Melbourne, Darryl Buckley, who is the founder of the Elysian Ensemble, he always talks about composers that interrogate the instrument. And so there's quite a lot of interrogation that needs to go on there. You really need to know how you can get as many different facets and colors and timbres as possible when you're dealing with that multiple instrument thing. So that, I must say, and then just generally sitting in the Philharmonic, and it didn't really matter whether it was something contemporary or not, just playing in that band. From that point on, as I got more and more into composing, just sitting in the viola section and listening to these great players around me was just a daily, dose of learning about, in particular, orchestration and orchestral color, but also, technical possibilities. I became good mates with the percussionists, and I was forever, I don't know whether they thought I was a good mate, but they were great friends to me. But I was constantly pestering them to go down into the percussion den under the stage and check out and try out various percussion instrument colors and so on. So it was it was that curiosity that sort of drove me to
gain this idiomatic way of writing for the instruments. I wonder whether we can, since we're talking about Berlin, something I wonder, you joined the Philharmonic, I believe, in 1984. Is that right?
I went to Berlin in 84 and started lessons there with Wolfram Christ, who at the time was the still relatively newly appointed principal violist there, and whom I'd met in Australia. I'd played for him at a masterclass, and it was through that connection with Wolfram, his invitation to come and study with him, that I came to Berlin in the first place. And my first ever experience of playing in the orchestra was at the end of 84 as a casual player. So, I remember going along. Yeah, well, I remember going along to my very first ever rehearsal with the Philharmonic, and they were trying me out on a not so difficult and not so sort of exposed kind of program. It was a choral concert with the Stabat Mater of Dvorak. But I was seated, and this was also great serendipitous stroke of fate. I was seated next to this wonderful, warm, and as it turned out, delightfully loving man called Siegbert Überscher, who at that stage was probably, I would guess, probably about the age I am now, sort of late 50s. He was sort of approaching his twilight retirement years. But this man was just such a music lover, such a great mensch, just such a delightful human being. Could tell that, the young lad from Australia who's studying with, Wolfram, who's up the front of the section, was pretty nervous. And he was just great at sort of putting me at my ease. Of course, then within 15 minutes max of this very first rehearsal, I'd come in on a downbeat all on my own, still absolutely naively unaware of just how far behind the beat the strings of the Berlin Philharmonic play, and particularly in those days. I think it was probably a pizzicato chord, because they're the real sort of, it's a never-ending fascination how they function there. And even in 15 years, I could never really quite work out why they would be this sort of extraordinary hesitation, and then ultimately be led by the principal bass player, and it would end up being like this big sort of guitar chord from the bottom up, arpeggiated upwards, anyway, so I come crashing in all on my own. I have my first solo moment, and I'm dying of embarrassment and thinking, oh God, that's that done. I'll never be asked back. And Siegbert just sort of, at the next appropriate moment, says, don't worry, just consider this a big chamber ensemble. Just breathe with me, just follow what I'm doing, as if we're the two violas in a quintet, and you'll get there. Don't worry about it. It's not a problem. And certainly already by the end of that first rehearsal, I could see what he was getting at, and he was the perfect person to sort of pass on this baton of exactly how, even in unspoken and hard to articulate ways, that orchestra functioned. And that was how I started out there, really.
That's so wonderful to hear that. And I can imagine that for him as well, he must have felt, as you say, if he was coming towards the end of his career with the Berlin Philharmonic, he would have wanted to play that role. But it's lovely to hear that, because it's not always the case that that young players, especially in that orchestra, but in many orchestras, that young players are given that kind of cradling and nurturing. But obviously, you were worth it, Brett. You were. But it's interesting to hear, and I wanted to follow that up by, what was it like, your first experiences playing with Carry-On? Because in the 80s, that would have, what was that like?
So, obviously, that Dvorak experience really wasn't so bad, because they got me in the next week to play with Carry-On. And, I'd only had that one choral concert experience, and then I was thrown into Berg Violin Concerto and Brahms 2. And Brahms 2 was kind of scary because, of course, Brahms symphonies, Beethoven symphonies, Bruckner symphonies, Strauss tone poems, and a few other things by that stage were so much repertoire. And also he was already sort of a conductor of waning powers, it must be said. Just physically, he was not a well man, and actually only at the most 2 years after that time, he was no longer able to stand. He had to have a kind of a special seat, bicycle seat, sort of rostrum to lean on, and so on. He was not well, and so there was not a great deal of rehearsal time for things like Brahms 2, which I actually, despite quite a lot of experience for QYO and AYO of some major repertoire, I'd never played second Brahms symphony before, and it got at most one run through. And yeah, it's not Strauss Elektra in terms of difficulty of the viola part, but it's no walk in the park either. Particularly surrounded by these fabulous players who've played it, could play it in their sleep. So that was kind of nerve-wracking. But what was fascinating and remained somehow a kind of a very early and yet sort of singular experience of Carry-On was that the Berg Violin Concerto was a piece that they hadn't done very often, hadn't done much in that time. It had been a few years since it had been done, and probably quite a few years since Carry-On himself had conducted it. And he really took it apart and rehearsed it. And, you know, even though, as I say, he was no longer the energetic, you know, 40-year-old who took on the job, you know, he was well into his 70s by then. In fact, mid to late 70s. He absolutely knew how that music was structured, really investigated the Hauptstimme, Nebenstimme ideas, you know, the sort of principal lines and secondary lines. First rehearsal without the soloist was Pierre Amoyal, the young French solo violinist. He came then the next day. So, you know, already that I found really, wow, this is serious and thoroughly fascinating. And as I say, there were only a few occasions otherwise that with Karajan, we went into that level of detail. I mean, again, with him, the opera experiences were formative and extraordinary. Don Carlos, he was a great Verdi and Puccini conductor. We did Don Carlos, we did Tosca 2 years running. They were also fantastic experiences, and that was an aspect of his repertoire that I'd perhaps not been so aware of. You know, as a young gun music student in Australia, I was, you know, right into all the big Austro-Germanic orchestral symphonic repertoire, you know, listening to his recording of Bruckner 9, for example, and that sort of thing. Totally was into that, but I hadn't realized just what an extraordinary Italian opera conductor he was. Anyway, so yeah, that they were amazing experiences, and so it was this combination of sheer terror of just having to, not only with Karajan, but all of it was, you know, new to me in many ways, particularly just that level of, or that pace. In those days, the orchestra also only had 2 rehearsals on, let's say, a Monday, a general rehearsal on a Tuesday, a concert Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and would start the cycle again on a Thursday with a new program. And it was actually not until maybe my 4th or 5th year there that there was also this movement from within the orchestra to kind of readdress how the orchestra functioned, and it then turned into this, what is now a kind of an industry standard in many places, a kind of 1 program per week, 3 performances, an extra day of rehearsals. The whole thing started to change around that time, and then with the change from Karajan to Abbado, that was, you know, even more established, and then the repertoire choices in themselves became more interesting too.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. I guess in Australia it used to be that 10 to 1, 2 to 5 kind of a thing, and then the rehearsal structure changed. I remember when the rehearsal structure changed in Lausanne as well. The first thing was that move from 3-hour to 2.5-hour rehearsals, and just yeah, this reduction. I actually now want to pivot to your year in the Tonhalle, which is my old orchestra, as the composer in residence. What did that entail, and what was that like? Just your, you know, was that through David Zinman, or how did that even come into being?
No, I mean, it certainly came from the Tonhalle, but David Zinman was no longer there by then.
Okay.
So it was Lionel was the chief conductor, but it was a project that evolved also through and with great input from my management, Inter Musica, who are fantastic, through my publishers, Boozy and Hawkes, again, ditto, just wonderful, wonderful institution in its own right, and incredibly supportive, obviously, in what they do. They're incredibly supportive of their composers. And it was a fascinating year because of all the various residencies I've had the fortune to be involved with, it was one of the most intense and far-reaching and so on. It's also called Creative Chair. So they were particularly keen to invite musicians who had various caps to wear. So the idea of also being a performer myself was certainly a part of that. And I think the previous season had been, for example, Jörg Widmann, wonderful German composer and extraordinary clarinetist and also conductor. And so, they were pursuing this ideal, which I really love, and that is presenting a composer as a complete musician and moving further and further, thankfully, away from the kind of, sort of post-war picture of the composer in an ivory tower only composing, and returning to this sense of the composer being a practical musician who is part of the creative process. So it was at the same time also a very interesting and not entirely uncomplicated year, which has continued now through the pandemic crisis. But it was the first year that the Tonhalle was out of the beautiful old Tonhalle and had moved into the temporary home, which is now probably in its 4th season, in Marg. Yeah, the Tonhalle Marg, which I have to say is an extraordinary building. I mean, you got to hand it to the Swiss. They first of all then have a referendum to sort of check with the general population whether they think this is a good idea. And that's to the credit of the Zurich people, that they supported this idea, that if we're going to do this, if we're going to rebuild the concert hall, we're going to do it properly. We're going to find them and then build them this amazing sort of temporary concert hall.
I just have to insert, I didn't learn about being Wenn Schon Denn Schon by accident. It was from being in Switzerland. The when they're going to do something, they do it.
They do it to the max. And this place was just, it was like, many cities don't have a hall that sounds as good as this, quote unquote temporary structure. It was beautiful. It is beautiful. But it was a challenge in that, you've then got to bring your audience with you. In that case, also, no doubt, an older audience, at least in the sort of subscription sort of bracket. You've got a lot of dyed-in-the-wool concert goers that know their routine and have their seat, and that wasn't easy, I don't think. Apart from anything else, also that wonderful structure as it was also not the same size either. It was quite a bit smaller. So there were, it upended a lot of their otherwise familiar structures of subscription series and marketing, and a part of town that, from what I then learnt, was, a little regarded as a bit seedy, and was sort of, it's an area that's sort of going through a blossoming now, but was, in the backs of many subscribers' minds, was probably thought of as a part of town you don't go to. So, it was a in some ways quite a challenge too, and for them, in a very different sort of space, but an incredibly enjoyable year where I sort of got to know these musicians better and better, and culminated also in a wonderful project that included conducting just the viola section in a piece of mine called Testament, for 12 violas, and also play directing the orchestra in Beethoven's Eroica, so leading from the front stand of the violas, which was a real thrill. And yeah, and I played my viola concerto there. I did chamber music with some of the players. There was a guest appearance in the course of the season of the Australian Chamber Orchestra, who happened to be on a European tour and were able to include a date in Zurich and present a couple of pieces of mine. And, you know, so it had so many different aspects to it. And with a great team of people there. It was a real joy.
Wow, that's wonderful. It's interesting that what you said before about the idea of the player, the performer, and the composer and conductor in your case, because that reminds me of when you were on tour with the Melbourne Symphony for Beggars and Angels, and in Zurich, at the concert in Zurich, you did the pre-concert talk. Well, it was a talk, but it was also almost a recital, I remember. Have you done that? Have you done that quite a lot? Was that a more of a unique thing, or is that something that happens quite often?
Yeah, that can happen quite a lot. It was particularly relevant in that case because the big piece, Beggars and Angels, it mentioned, was also a piece that grew out of, as unlikely as it might seem, because it's a piece for huge orchestra, but it grew out of a solo viola piece called Intimate Decision.
Okay.
And so that's why there was a kind of, you know, there was a logic to that. But certainly, you know, there is, I think, as I was saying about the Zurich Creative Chair Initiative, I think that's also one of the most welcome things of our time is trying to place the composer more in the center of a music making community rather than the ivory tower ideal of the past of you know, and I mean, when you look back, I mean, it's a relatively short period of time that certainly seemed to be ushered in with the post-war period, because up until then you still had these prominent composer-performer figures such as Bartók and Stravinsky and Rachmaninoff and so on, who would premiere their own works. And, you know, it's really only in that sort of post-war period that you have the composer as composer only type of thing. And it's starting to, whilst there's still, you know, there's still that aspect around, but I think, you know, composer performers are no longer the rare birds that they were there for a while. And, you know, when you have not only great composers, but performers of the caliber of people like Tom Addis and George Benjamin and so on. John Adams, who's, you know, a formidable conductor as well. And these are the leading, you know, compositional voices of our age, then it's a great thing. I think it sort of reminds also audiences that composers are people too. Absolutely.
Brett, I've really loved this meandering, you know, obviously in an hour we can't cover the breadth and depth of your career, but I've really enjoyed this meandering through Nimbin and Berlin and Zurich and Sweden. I've really enjoyed it a lot. And I do have one final little topic that I'd like to broach with you. I was watching a video that you made for the London Philharmonic where you talked about how to start composing, and you were talking about how just to get some ideas down, and sometimes you play a bit at the viola, sometimes you might play some chords on the piano. I wonder if you could just talk about that. Where are you at a beginning stage with the work now, or maybe you're at a mid stage with the work? Just talk a little bit about your compositional process, because I find it fascinating, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on either where you're at now with the work or talking about that beginning process.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that video was also specifically for young musicians, still at school, perhaps also musicians that don't even know whether they're wanting to be a composer or not, but certainly school students that have shown some interest in it. And I just sort of went down that tack of just sort of, first of all, saying, get something out onto the page, just because it also, my wife Heather, whom you know well, and says to say hi as well. I mean, as a visual artist, she also has talked often of that. The blank canvas thing can really do your head in if you're not careful, or the writer's block thing. And, the best way through that is just to break the ice and doesn't, as I was encouraging these young school students, just doesn't really even matter what, just make a venture into some sort of scribble and start accruing material. That's the easiest and quickest way to sort of embark. But I mean, you asked where I'm at the moment. I've just finished a piece for a series of festivals that, who knows whether they're going to happen this year or not, but I hope so, because everything I've written in the past 12 months, like with every other composer on the planet, I'm sure, has been either cancelled or postponed. And this one, I have a hope that it might happen, because it's a piano quartet, so it's a relatively small group of players. It's for chamber music festivals that probably can still survive with limited numbers of audience, and may end up presenting some of their concerts as online only. We'll see. But the particular beginnings of that piece actually go back a couple of years. It was, strangely enough, a piece that I'd started back in the end of 2019 and then put aside, and then COVID happened, and all sorts of circumstances around that. But indeed, I mean, often the starting process is just as I described it for these students, that just get something happening. So going back to my beginnings as a composer, I got into composing, as I said, I'd not really studied it. I was, trained as a performer. I did viola and chamber music and so on, and I never actually studied composition formally. And my beginnings, when I really started getting into it in Berlin, was with a group that I formed with a rock musician friend who was traveling to Berlin with a band from Sydney, and we started improvising together. And so through that improvising process, and our first pieces were often just put together in studios with playback and multi-tracking and so on. And it was only from that it turned into a kind of more notated compositional process for me. But that is also a very immediate thing. You kind of start a piece by making some noise and seeing where it leads. And so, I've in a way sort of adopted the same principle for notated works as well. What is then interesting is I've, with the passing of the years and then doing quite a lot of vocal works for vocal forces, is how different it is when you've got a text in front of you, because that actually already has done that first step for you. It's there is something on the page. It's a series of words. And in some ways I've found, although they're massive and daunting projects, writing operas or large-scale choral or vocal works can be easier because you've got something to hang on to right from the start. And so that's been an interesting learning process as well.
Yeah, I another time I want to talk about your opera Bliss, but that'll be for a sequel, because I would love to talk about that. I have time for one more question, and this question is, I don't ask it of everyone, but it's inspired by our mutual good friend Fabian Russell, And when I interviewed him, I asked this question. I sometimes ask it, what music would you like to have played at your funeral?
Oh, gosh. Schubert Quintet with 2 cellos. Slow movement. But
Nice.
maybe also, yeah, so just so that it's not just too sad.
I was
No,
just imagining when you said that,
mind.
the first thing that came to my mind was,
yeah. No, I was meaning the slow movement.
I know. But
maybe it's a bit self-indulgent. It's really long, and you've got to sort of, make people sit there and listen and think sad thoughts. But anyway, no, I don't know.
Wonderful.
I mean, it's interesting that, the recently departed Prince Philip sort of really planned his funeral. I mean, he had time on his hands too. Yeah, I don't know. I'd like some Kortag in there somewhere, I think, too.
Nice.
One of my great heroes, and a composer who, really captures the essence of a personality even within 30 seconds of music. Yeah.
Wonderful. Kortag and Schubert.
That sounds like a good mix.
Definitely. Brett, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. I'm sure that the Wenn Schon Denn Schon audience will love watching this video and getting all of the nuggets of wisdom and just enjoying the ride of hearing you talk about so many different topics. I thank you very much. And I'm going to say farewell to the audience.